If you call Gen Z and they don't answer, you probably assume one thing: they're anxious. But that explanation is lazy, because this same generation will live stream to thousands. They'll sit in Discord calls all night. They'll FaceTime for hours. They'll send 5-minute voice notes without hesitation. So clearly, they can talk. They just don't want to talk when you decide. And that difference changes everything. Because this isn't about fear, it's about control. The phone rings. They see the name. They watch it buzz. And they let it die. Not because they're scared, but because answering means the conversation now controls them. It controls their time, their attention, their mental space. And Gen Z doesn't give up control easily. Now here's where this gets uncomfortable. Older generations look at this and think, they're fragile. They can't handle real conversation. They're socially anxious. But that explanation falls apart fast, because Gen Z isn't avoiding conversation. They're avoiding interruption. That's not the same thing. A phone call is immediate, unplanned, unscripted, uncontained. You don't know how long it will last. You don't know what direction it will go. You don't know what you'll be asked. It demands you now. Texting doesn't. Texting gives you space. It gives you pause. It gives you control over tone, timing, and response. You can think before you reply. You can rewrite a sentence. You can wait until you feel ready. Texting is controlled. Phone calls are unpredictable. And Gen Z grew up in a world where unpredictability was reduced and control was increased. Notifications can be muted. Messages can be answered later. Conversations can be exited. Presence is optional. So when the phone rings unexpectedly, it doesn't feel neutral. It feels intrusive. That word might sound dramatic, but psychologically, it's accurate. A call overrides your environment. It interrupts your focus. It demands emotional availability in real time. And Gen Z was raised in a world where attention is curated, not seized. That shift matters, because older generations were trained for interruption. Landlines rang without warning. People knocked without texting first. Drop-ins were normal. You answered. Adaptation was expected. Gen Z was trained for autonomy. Choice is default. Engagement is voluntary. So when the phone rings, friction appears. Not because they can't talk, but because the timing isn't theirs. And here's the line that might divide people. Gen Z doesn't avoid calls because they lack social skills. They avoid calls because they value psychological control. That's not weakness. That's boundary awareness. But here's the deeper layer. If it's only about boundaries, why does a short call sometimes feel draining? Why does 2 minutes feel heavier than it should? That's not just preference, that's exposure. And exposure hits differently when you grew up constantly being evaluated. We'll get into that next. But first, be honest. When your phone rings, do you ignore it on purpose? Or do you tell yourself you'll call back later and quietly hope the moment passes? Think about that, because how you answer probably says more about your generation than you realize. Here's the deeper layer. If avoiding calls was only about boundaries, it wouldn't feel draining, but for a lot of Gen Z adults, a short phone call feels heavy. Not scary. Heavy. Why? Because phone calls remove the buffer. When you text, you control how you sound. You can rewrite a sentence, you can soften your tone, you can delete something that feels off. On a call, you're live. No draft, no preview, no edit button. Your tone reveals you. Your hesitation exposes you. Your silence becomes awkward. And exposure feels different when you grew up being evaluated constantly. Think about it. Grades were online. Followers were counted. Comments were public. Mistakes were screenshot. Everything could be judged. Everything could be shared. When you grow up in that environment, you learn to manage output carefully. You learn to think before you send, to filter before you post, to adjust before you publish. Texting fits that system. Phone calls don't. A call collapses distance. You don't get time to compose. You don't get time to regulate. You don't get time to shape perception. And that's where friction shows up. Not because Gen Z can't communicate, but because they were trained in asynchronous communication. They were raised to respond, not react, and that rewires behavior. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Some of what looks like anxiety is actually avoidance of emotional labor. Stay with me. On a phone call, you have to process in real time. You have to listen, think, respond, adjust your tone. All at once, that's cognitive load. Texting spreads that load out. It lets you engage when you feel ready, and that feels lighter. But lighter doesn't always mean better, because growth usually happens in moments you didn't schedule. And phone calls are unscheduled growth. That line will divide people. Good. It should. Now here's the paradox. Gen Z is the most emotionally literate generation in history. They talk about boundaries, attachment styles, triggers, emotional regulation. They can write paragraphs about how they feel. So how can a generation that understands emotions so well avoid real-time emotional exchange? Because articulation and spontaneity are not the same skill. You can understand emotions deeply and still feel friction delivering them live. That's not hypocrisy, that's conditioning. And here's the identity mirror moment. If you're Gen Z watching this, you might be thinking, it's just easier to text. You're right, it is easier. But easier often means lower exposure, lower unpredictability, lower immediate discomfort, and sometimes lower resilience. That's not an attack, it's a question. Because older generations built resilience through interruption. Gen Z builds resilience through articulation. Both build strength. Just in different ways, but here's the real tension. If you remove too much spontaneous interaction, do you slowly lower your tolerance for it? That's the part nobody likes to say out loud. So let me ask you directly, when the phone rings, are you protecting your peace? Or protecting yourself from being unfiltered? And answer honestly, because the difference between those two is everything. Here's where this conversation gets bigger. Because this isn't really about phone calls, it's about stress tolerance. Older generations were trained to handle interruption. The phone rang, you answered. Someone showed up, you adapted. Silence got awkward, you sat through it. Discomfort wasn't optional, it was normal. Gen Z was trained differently. Choice is default. Access is controlled. Engagement is voluntary. If something feels draining, reduce it. If something feels intrusive, filter it. If something feels overwhelming, delay it. That's not weakness, that's optimization. But optimization always has trade-offs. And here's the tension. If you reduce too much unpredictability, you reduce exposure to it. And resilience is built in exposure, not avoidance. Now before Gen Z gets defensive, this applies to every generation. Gen X tolerated too much emotional silence. Millennials over-explained everything. Gen Z filters everything. Every generation overcorrects something. But here's the real friction point. Older generations equate availability with respect. If someone calls, you answer. Answering signals maturity. Responsibility, reliability. Gen Z doesn't see it that way. To them, immediate answering signals, you own my time. And that feels wrong, that clash. That's where the emotional reaction comes from. Boomers see disrespect. Gen X sees fragility. Millennials see anxiety. Gen Z sees autonomy. All four believe they're right, and they are, from their frame. But here's the uncomfortable twist. If Gen Z values boundaries so strongly, why do so many struggle with confrontation? Why send a long message instead of having the hard conversation live? Why does real-time conflict feel heavier than asynchronous disagreement? That's not just control. That's exposure sensitivity. Phone calls collapse distance. You can't soften tone after you say it. You can't edit delivery. You can't retreat mid-sentence. It's raw. And raw feels risky when you grew up in a performative environment. But here's the paradox. Gen Z might not be avoiding phone calls. They might be redesigning social norms. Every generation redesigns something. Gen X rejected emotional openness. Millennials rejected emotional suppression. Gen Z is rejecting forced availability. But redesigning norms always feels like rebellion to the generation before. That's history. Now here's the real question. What kind of resilience are we building? Control-based resilience? Or adaptability-based resilience? Because the strongest generation won't be the one that demands instant access. And it won't be the one that avoids it entirely. It will be the one that can switch. Text when it's efficient, call when it's necessary, handle discomfort when it shows up, and stay grounded when things go live. Because real strength isn't never feeling friction, it's being able to operate through it. So maybe the real question isn't, Why does Gen Z avoid phone calls? Maybe it's this. When the phone rings, can you answer it if it matters? Not because it's comfortable, but because growth rarely is. And here's where I want the comments to explode. Is avoiding phone calls smart boundary setting or slow emotional insulation? And don't give the socially acceptable answer. Give the honest one. Because how you answer that question probably reveals your generation.